Evening arrives without urgency. It does not rush across the sky, nor does it announce itself with sharp edges or sudden changes. Instead, it settles softly like a familiar blanket being placed over tired shoulders. The light of the day begins to thin, stretching long and pale, as if it knows there is no need to hurry anymore. Somewhere beyond the edges of thought, the sun lowers itself with quiet dignity. Not disappearing, not leaving, only stepping aside, the air cools just enough to be noticed. Not cold, just calm. This is the hour when the world exhales. Streets that once carried footsteps and purpose now grow spacious again. Doors close gently, without finality. Voices lower on their own, as though even conversation understands that it is time to rest. Nothing is demanded of you here. Nothing is expected. You are simply allowed to arrive. As the sky deepens, the first lantern is lit. It glows not brightly, but warmly, an amber breath of light held inside glass. Then another lantern follows, and another. Slowly, patiently, until the streets resemble a constellation that has drifted down from the heavens and chosen to rest among stone and wood. These lights do not compete with the dark. They cooperate with it. They exist only to soften the night. If you imagine yourself standing there between day and night, you might notice how your own breathing begins to change. Longer exhales, shallower thoughts. A subtle loosening somewhere behind the eyes. Nothing pulls at your attention. Nothing needs solving. And in this gentle moment, a story begins to form, not loudly, not insistently, but the way memories do when they feel safe enough to surface. Tonight, we will wander through a place shaped by time, patience, and quiet human care. A place from history not remembered for its wars or its rulers, but for its stillness. For how it understood the art of slowing down long before the modern world forgot how. But before we drift deeper into tonight's gentle journey, remember to subscribe to Tedious History for Sleep. Here, you'll always find peaceful stories that soothe the heart and quiet the mind. Where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment. Your presence adds warmth to this quiet corner of the night. Now, allow your shoulders to soften. Allow the muscles in your face to rest, as though you are no longer being seen. And let us step unhurried into the past. Long ago, in a civilization shaped as much by silence as by stone, evenings were treated with reverence. People believed that how a day ended mattered just as much as how it began. Perhaps more. They understood something we are only now remembering, that the human spirit needs gentle landings. This city, whose name has thinned with centuries, was not built to impress the sky. Its buildings did not claw upward. Instead, they settled into the earth with humility, arranged around courtyards, gardens, and narrow paths that curved just enough to slow the walker's pace. Stone underfoot was smooth, worn by generations who had passed this way not in haste, but in habit. As dusk approached, the city changed its rhythm without instruction. Shops closed not with clatter, but with ritual. Cloth awnings were folded, wooden panels slid into place. There was no rush to finish because nothing waited on the other side. Even commerce understood rest. The air carried familiar scents: aged wood, steeped leaves, the faint sweetness of grain left to cool. These were not sharp smells. They did not demand recognition. They hovered gently, like a thought you don't need to complete. In this place, time was not measured by clocks. It was measured by light. By the moment the lanterns appeared, by the warmth of the first cup of evening tea, by the softening of conversation into listening. Homes glowed from within, not brightly, but consistently. Families gathered not to be entertained, but simply to be together. No one asked how productive the day had been. No one listed what remained undone. There was an unspoken agreement that the night was not for effort. It was for returning. Returning to oneself. Returning to what had been set aside. Returning to the quiet truth that existing was enough. And if you listen closely, even now you might feel that same permission settling over you. You do not need to remember everything. You do not need to prepare for tomorrow. You do not need to hold the weight of the day anymore. Just as the city allowed its lights to carry the night, you can allow this story to carry you. As lantern after lantern came to life, their reflections shimmered faintly on stone paths and shallow pools. The city seemed to breathe in golden tones. Shadows lengthened, but they did not threaten. They simply rested beside the light. And somewhere, tucked away beyond the main streets, there existed a place spoken of in quieter voices. Not secret, just gentle. A space where time was said to soften even further. Where stories were not told to impress, but to soothe. Where history was not recited, but remembered, slowly, tenderly, like a lullaby passed between generations. It was not marked on official maps. But people knew how to find it. They always did. And as you follow that knowing without effort, without urgency, you may begin to sense a delicate curiosity forming. Not excitement, just a mild, pleasant wondering. What kind of place allows time to rest? What kind of history does not push forward but invites you to lie down inside it? The lantern light flickers once. The path curves gently ahead. And the night opens its arms just a little wider. The path does not announce itself, and that is its kindness. Because it curves away from the brighter streets without ceremony, guiding you with a gentleness that feels almost instinctive, as though your body remembers this way even if your mind does not. And as you follow it, the lanterns thin slightly, their light spreading wider, softer, allowing more shadow to exist without fear. And in this quieter pocket of the city, sound itself begins to change, footsteps becoming muted, voices dissolving into murmurs that no longer seek response, and the city, once a collection of tasks and directions, slowly reveals another nature entirely, one that was always present but rarely noticed, a living rhythm that expands and contracts like breath. Here, buildings sit lower, roofs sloping inward as if bowing to the night, windows half covered by fabric screens that glow faintly from within. And through them, you sense life continuing not in urgency but in ease, people reclining rather than standing. Hands wrapped around warm cups, eyes softened by lamplight rather than sharpened by purpose. And the air itself seems to move more slowly, carrying with it the quiet perfume of steeped herbs and old paper. A scent that suggests memory rather than novelty, something known rather than new. This district was never the heart of trade or governance. It held no offices of command, no halls of judgment, and that was precisely why people came here when the day had taken enough from them. Because nothing in this place asked to be proven. Nothing evaluated worth or speed or success, and as you drift deeper into it, you may notice how your own inner dialogue begins to loosen. Thoughts no longer stacking themselves in neat lines but spreading out, unhurried, like clouds that no longer need to become rain. In the historical records that survived them, fragile things copied by careful hands, this area was described not as a destination but as a pause. A place between obligations, and the language used to describe it is telling. Words that translate roughly to resting ground, listening quarter, or simply where the evening stays. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about this part of the city is how intentionally unremarkable it appears. No grand monuments, no declarations carved in stone, only small courtyards hidden behind wooden gates, where gardens grew not for display, but for balance. Smooth stones arranged beside water basins, so still they reflected the lantern light without distortion. And historians believe that these spaces were tended collectively, not owned, not claimed, but cared for, because care itself was understood as a shared responsibility. As you imagine walking here, notice how nothing rushes you forward. Paths loop gently, inviting wandering rather than arrival. And even if you were to stop completely, the place would not resist you. It would simply continue being what it is: patient, present, and this quality, this lack of insistence, is what allowed the city's deeper traditions to survive for so long, because while empires rose and fell beyond its walls, this quiet understanding endured, passed not through decree but through habit, through the nightly repetition of slowing down together. And you might find it comforting to know that the people who lived here faced uncertainties no less real than our own. Seasons that failed, rulers who changed, futures that remained unknowable, yet still. They chose to build a rhythm that honored rest as something essential rather than earned. If you listen closely now, you may sense the faintest sound of water somewhere nearby, not flowing, just shifting gently, as if responding to a breeze, and that sound, barely there, was once considered the true heartbeat of this place, a reminder that life does not need to surge to continue, that even the smallest movement, repeated with care, can sustain something lasting. This understanding shaped the way stories were told here as well, not in grand arcs or dramatic turns, but in fragments, reflections, moments shared quietly between people who were no longer trying to impress one another. And it is said that in this district, history itself was treated less like a record of events and more like a companion, something to sit beside rather than stand before. And perhaps that is why, even now, as centuries separate you from those evenings, the atmosphere feels strangely familiar, as though your nervous system recognizes the pattern, the slowing, the permission to simply be. If tonight you have carried worries that felt too heavy to set down, you might imagine placing them here, not to discard them, but to rest them, just for a while, letting them exist without attention. And in doing so, you join a long, quiet lineage of people who understood that peace does not come from resolution alone, but from rhythm, from returning again and again to a place where nothing asks more of you than presence. And as the lantern light continues to glow steadily, neither brightening nor dimming, the path ahead opens into an even softer space, one that holds a particular story spoken of not often but fondly, and the city, sensing your readiness, seems to grow just a little quieter, inviting you to take the next gentle step inward. Beyond the gentle bend of the path, the city opens not outward but inward, revealing a courtyard so modest it might be missed by anyone still searching for importance. And yet this space has held centuries of quiet presence, a square of earth cradled by low wooden walkways, its surface layered with smooth stone and soft moss, arranged not for symmetry but for calm, and at its center rests a shallow pool of water, dark and reflective, so still that the lantern light upon it seems less like a reflection and more like a second sky laid carefully at your feet. And as you imagine stepping into this courtyard, you may notice how instinctively your pace slows further, not because you are told to, but because there is nowhere left to rush toward, nowhere pulling you forward, and the night air here feels denser somehow, warmer, as if it has been holding the day's final warmth and offering it back without expectation. This courtyard was known, in the language of its time, by a phrase that does not translate cleanly, something close to the place where words become unnecessary, and historically it served no official function. No ceremonies were mandated here, no announcements made, yet it endured far longer than many grand halls, precisely because it belonged to everyone and no one at once, and people came here after meals, after long walks, after conversations that had already said enough. They came not to speak, but to sit, to share silence in a way that felt companionable rather than empty. Benches carved from old timber lined the edges, worn smooth by countless hands, and if you were to rest your palm upon one, you might imagine the faint impression of those who had done the same before you. Merchants whose voices had quieted for the night, scholars who had set their scrolls aside, travelers who had found in this place a kind of temporary belonging. And what connected them all was not status or ambition, but a shared understanding that the day had reached its natural end, and that there was dignity in honoring that ending. The water in the center of the courtyard was not decorative, it was practical, fed by a narrow channel that carried runoff from the surrounding roofs. And yet, over time it became something more, because people noticed how the surface reflected not only light but mood, how on restless evenings it seemed darker, deeper, while on calm nights it appeared almost luminous, and though no one claimed it had magic, many believed it offered a quiet truth, that the world often mirrors what we bring to it, especially when we are still enough to notice. Stories shared here were rarely complete narratives, more often fragments, remembered moments, gentle observations offered without expectation of response. And the tradition was simple. One person might speak softly, and when their words settled, no one rushed to fill the space. Silence was allowed to breathe, and in that breathing, something subtle happened. People felt heard without being examined, understood without being analyzed. And this manner of sharing shaped the culture deeply, teaching generations that meaning does not always arrive through explanation. Sometimes it arrives through presence alone. If you imagine yourself sitting here now, You might notice how your thoughts begin to behave differently, not clustering or racing, but drifting, touching briefly before moving on. And this is not a loss of focus, but a return to something older, a way of being that predates constant stimulation. And the people of this city understood that when the mind is allowed to wander gently, it often finds its own balance. Historical accounts suggest that visitors from other regions found this place perplexing. They expected entertainment, instruction, something to do, and instead they were offered space. And many wrote of an initial discomfort followed by an unexpected ease, as though their bodies had been waiting for permission to stop performing, and perhaps that resonates even now, because modern life, despite its speed, rarely offers true pauses. Moments where nothing is asked and nothing is tracked, and this courtyard existed as a quiet counterpoint to that impulse long before it had a name. The lanterns here were fewer placed deliberately low, their light brushing the ground rather than flooding it, ensuring that shadows remained not as something to fear, but as a natural part of the scene, and the interplay between light and dark was considered essential. A reminder that balance does not mean uniform brightness, but gentle contrast. As night deepened, the air cooled slightly, and those gathered would draw their robes closer. A shared gesture that required no comment, and sometimes someone would pour tea, not ceremoniously, simply because the kettle was warm and the cups were nearby. And the sound of liquid meeting porcelain became part of the courtyard's quiet language, a sound that told the body it was safe to soften further. If you find your eyelids growing heavier as you imagine this place, that is no accident. The rhythms described here mirror the natural slowing of the nervous system, the gentle cues that tell the brain it may release its vigilance. And even now, you might allow your breathing to follow that cue, inhaling without effort, exhaling a little longer, letting the story carry you rather than following it closely. This courtyard did not exist to impress future generations. Yet it did something perhaps more enduring. It taught people how to rest together, how to share time without filling it, and that lesson, though rarely recorded explicitly, is one of the quiet threads that runs through history, connecting moments of human care across centuries. And as the night continues to settle around you, the courtyard seems to draw you closer to its center, not physically, but inwardly, toward a space where curiosity is gentle and discovery feels safe because there is something else here. Something the people of this city came to understand over many nights, a realization that arrives slowly, like sleep itself, and as you remain in this calm, reflective space, that realization begins to take shape, ready to be noticed when the mind is quiet enough to receive it. As the courtyard settles into deeper night, something subtle begins to happen, something that cannot be marked or measured, yet is felt by nearly everyone who spends enough time here, a loosening of time's grip, as though the hours themselves have decided to step back and observe rather than direct. And this sensation was noted again and again in the quiet writings left behind by travelers and residents alike, not as a marvel or miracle, but as a gentle shift, a sense that moments no longer pressed forward in a straight line, but spread outward, allowing each breath to feel complete on its own. The people of this city did not speak of time as something to be used or saved. Their language described it more like weather, something that moved through life rather than against it. And in places like this courtyard, time was believed to become especially calm, not stopping, not slowing dramatically, but smoothing itself, like water after a stone has been removed. And this belief shaped behavior in small, meaningful ways. People lingered without guilt. They left without urgency, and they trusted that whatever awaited them beyond the night could wait a little longer. Historians who later studied this culture often struggle to explain how such an unhurried approach could coexist with a functioning society, yet records show that this city thrived quietly for generations. Trade continued, knowledge grew, families endured, suggesting that productivity and peace were not opposites here, but companions, balanced carefully through ritual and rhythm. One of the most enduring customs associated with the courtyard was the practice of evening reflection, though calling it a practice might be misleading, because there were no instructions, no formal steps, simply a shared understanding that as night deepened, attention turned inward. People might recall a moment from the day that lingered, not to judge it, but to acknowledge it, and in doing so, They allowed the mind to settle unfinished thoughts gently, rather than carrying them into restless sleep. If you imagine yourself participating in this now, you might notice a memory rising on its own, something small and unremarkable, perhaps a sound, a glance, a fleeting feeling, and rather than analyzing it, you simply let it be present for a moment before allowing it to fade. And this simple act mirrors what the people here understood intuitively, that peace often comes not from resolution, but from allowing experiences to pass through without resistance. The architecture surrounding the courtyard reinforced this philosophy. Walls were thick, not imposing, but insulating, creating a sense of enclosure that muffled distant noise and narrowed the field of attention. Roofs extended outward, just enough to frame the sky without exposing it fully, offering a sense of shelter while still allowing the stars to be seen, and this balance between openness and protection was intentional, designed to help the body feel secure while the mind expanded gently. And many visitors wrote that they slept more deeply after spending an evening here, even if they did nothing but sit quietly listening to the faint sounds of night. Among the few artifacts recovered from this area were simple objects, cups worn thin at the rim stones, polished smooth by touch scraps of fabric folded and refolded until they held the shape of care. And these items tell a story not of wealth or power, but of continuity, of small gestures repeated with attention. And in those repetitions, a culture preserved its sense of calm, even as the world beyond changed. The idea that time could soften was not unique to this city, but here it was cultivated deliberately, through spaces that invited stillness and through social norms that respected rest. And this cultivation had profound effects on how people related to one another. Conversations were less reactive, disagreements cooled more quickly, and silence was not seen as awkward but as shared ground. If you find yourself growing drowsy as these images settle, that is a natural response, because the mind, when released from constant tracking of time, begins to follow older rhythms, the ones tied to light and dark, to breath and heartbeat. And even now, you may notice how the story feels less like information and more like a gentle environment, something you are inside rather than following. And that is precisely how the people of this city experience their evenings, not as events to remember, but as states to inhabit. There is a quiet comfort in knowing that long before modern concerns, humans found ways to protect their inner quiet, not through isolation, but through shared understanding, and this courtyard stands as a soft testament to that wisdom. A reminder that time does not always need to be mastered. Sometimes it simply needs to be allowed to rest alongside us. And as this understanding settles, the night seems to deepen further, drawing attention not forward, but inward, toward a realization that was once shared here in whispers, and poses a realization about memory, presence, and the gentle way they intertwine, waiting patiently to be felt rather than explained. As the night settles more fully into itself, the courtyard seems to shift in a way that is almost imperceptible, not changing its shape or sound, but altering the quality of attention it invites, as if it has grown confident that those who remain are ready for something quieter still. Something that does not arrive as a thought, but as a feeling. And the people who once gathered here understood this transition well, though they rarely named it. They simply allowed it because naming would have required grasping, and this place was never meant to be grasped. Memory here behaved differently than it did elsewhere in the city. It did not arrive in sharp images or narratives demanding interpretation. Instead, it surfaced gently, like warmth returning to cold hands, subtle and diffuse. And many believe that this was because memory, when left unpressured, reveals its truest form, not as a record of events, but as an atmosphere, a tone, a sense of how something once felt rather than what exactly occurred. Scholars who studied this culture much later wrote with fascination about this approach, noting that the people here did not place great emphasis on preserving detailed personal histories. Diaries were rare, accounts brief, and yet there was a profound continuity of identity across generations. As if memory lived not in words but in shared rhythms, in the way evenings unfolded similarly year after year, creating a collective familiarity that did not depend on specifics. If you imagine yourself sitting quietly in the courtyard now, you might notice a memory rising that does not attach itself to a clear timeline, perhaps a feeling of being safe somewhere long ago. or the sense of a quiet room at night, or the sound of someone moving gently nearby, and rather than following that memory to its origin, you allow it to hover, to exist without explanation, and this mirrors exactly what the people here practiced. A way of relating to the past that did not demand clarity, only presence. This approach had a soothing effect on the mind, because it removed the pressure to make sense of everything, and in doing so, it allowed experiences to settle naturally, finding their place without being forced. And this was especially important at night, when the mind is more porous, more receptive, and more easily overwhelmed if asked to organize or evaluate. The courtyard, with its steady lantern light and unchanging geometry, acted as a stabilizing frame for this inner movement, offering just enough consistency to support the gentle drift of thought. And those who spent time here often described a sensation of being accompanied by the past without being burdened by it, as though memories were sitting nearby rather than pressing inward. This understanding extended beyond personal memory to history itself. Events were acknowledged, changes noted, but there was little inclination to dramatize or romanticize, because the people here sensed that history, like memory, loses its softness when it is held too tightly. And so stories of earlier times were told in fragments, pauses, and impressions, allowing listeners to feel the continuity of human experience without becoming entangled in details. One traveler wrote that listening to these stories felt less like learning and more like remembering, something he had never lived, a recognition that surprised him and stayed long after he left. And perhaps that feeling resonates even now because the human nervous system responds deeply to familiarity, even when it cannot identify its source. As you rest within this atmosphere, you may notice how your body responds. Muscles releasing tension they have carried without awareness. Breath settling into a rhythm that feels natural rather than managed. And this response is not accidental. It is the result of an environment designed to support the nervous system's need for safety and predictability, something this culture intuitively understood long before modern language described it. The lanterns here do not flicker unpredictably. The water does not ripple unless stirred. Sounds remain low and consistent, all of which sends a quiet message to the brain that vigilance is no longer required. And in this state, memory becomes less about retrieval and more about release, allowing what no longer needs attention to fade, and what remains to soften. There is a particular kindness in this approach, because it acknowledges that not all memories need to be processed or resolved. Some simply need space to rest, and the people of this city honored that need by creating spaces like this courtyard where memory could exist without obligation. If you find that your thoughts are becoming less distinct as you listen, that is a sign that you are entering the same gentle territory they did, where the boundary between present and past blurs just enough to allow rest. And in this blurred space, insight arises not as revelation, but as quiet acceptance. The courtyard holds this state patiently, night after night, century after century, asking nothing, offering everything in small, almost invisible ways. And as you remain here, held by the steady light and the unchanging air, you may sense that there is one more layer to this place, one more understanding that the people here arrive at slowly, something about how memory, time, and rest are not separate experiences, but different expressions of the same gentle movement, a movement that now carries you forward, effortlessly, toward deeper calm. As you remain here, you might sense your own thoughts becoming quieter, not disappearing, but spacing themselves out, allowing silence to exist between them, and that silence is not empty. It is full of subtle reassurance, the kind that does not come from words, but from rhythm, from the steady continuity of breath and presence. The people of this city trusted this process deeply, which is why they did not rush away from it. They lingered until the night felt complete, until their bodies signaled readiness for rest, and only then did they rise, moving slowly, carrying the calm with them like a warm layer against the cooling air. If you imagine standing now, you might feel how the ground beneath your feet seems solid and familiar, as though it has supported countless similar moments. And that sense of being supported both literally and metaphorically is one of the most enduring gifts this place offered. The courtyard does not demand that you stay, but it also does not hurry you away. It simply remains, listening, holding, and as you rest within this imagined space, you may find that the line between listening and being listened to becomes less distinct, dissolving into a shared stillness that feels deeply reassuring, and in that shared stillness, another understanding begins to form, one that the people here came to know not through instruction, but through experience, an understanding about rest not as absence, but as connection, quietly unfolding as the night continues its gentle work. As the night holds its steady presence over the courtyard, there comes a moment so subtle it could be missed entirely when understanding arises without effort, not as a conclusion, not as a lesson, but as a quiet alignment between what is felt and what simply is. And the people who return to this place night after night recognized this moment, not by any signal, but by a sense of ease that spread through them, a feeling that nothing more was required, and this, perhaps, was the most important realization the courtyard offered, that rest is not something to be achieved, but something that happens naturally when resistance softens. In this culture, there was a belief that truth, when approached gently, does not need to announce itself. It arrives in the same way sleep does, gradually, almost invisibly, until suddenly you are inside it. And the courtyard was designed to support this arrival, not through instruction or symbolism, but through consistency, through the repeated experience of being allowed to slow down without consequence. If you imagine yourself here now, you may notice that your attention no longer feels pulled toward any particular thought or image. Instead, it rests more diffusely, aware without focus, and this state was deeply valued by the people of this city, though they did not have a single word for it. They described it in phrases that suggested openness, softness, or simply being at ease with the moment. Historians later observed that this way of relating to experience had far-reaching effects, shaping not only how people rested, but how they lived. Decisions were made with patience. Conflicts approached with less urgency, and even grief was held within a wider context of continuity, allowing sorrow to exist without overwhelming the whole of life. The courtyard, in this sense, functioned as a quiet teacher, not by imparting knowledge, but by modeling a way of being, showing through its very existence that stability does not require rigidity, that openness does not require exposure, and that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of enough safety to let difficulty rest. As the night deepens further, the lanterns burn steadily, their light unchanged, and this unchanging quality sends a powerful, wordless message to the nervous system, that the environment is predictable, that nothing sudden will occur, and in response, the body releases its vigilance, allowing deeper layers of rest to emerge. You might notice this now as a heaviness in the limbs, a pleasant weight that anchors you to where you are, making movement feel unnecessary. And this sensation was familiar to those who spent evenings here. They described it as the night settling into them, a phrase that suggests partnership rather than surrender. The gentle truth that emerged in this state was not complex, yet it was profound, that being held whether by a place, a rhythm, or a shared understanding allows the mind to let go of its constant scanning, its need to anticipate, and in that letting go, a deeper intelligence takes over, one that knows how to restore balance without conscious effort. The people of this city trusted this intelligence, which is why they did not fill their evenings with stimulation. They allowed space, silence, and repetition to do their quiet work, and over time, this trust became embedded in their culture. passed from one generation to the next through practice rather than explanation. If you find that your awareness feels softer now, less defined, that is a sign that you are touching the same state they did, where clarity is replaced by calm and meaning is felt rather than understood. And this state does not need to be held onto. In fact, it cannot be. It emerges only when grasping stops. The courtyard does not attempt to preserve this moment. It simply continues to exist, knowing that those who need it will return, and those who do not will pass by without harm. And this non-attachment is part of its wisdom, offering without insisting, supporting without binding. As the night progresses, the stars overhead shift slightly, their movement slow and almost imperceptible, reinforcing the sense that time continues, but gently, without pressure. And this reassurance allows the final layers of tension to dissolve, making space for rest that is deep and unguarded. The people who left the courtyard late at night often did so quietly, carrying with them not a memory they could recount, but a state they could return to, a sense of inner alignment that made sleep come more easily and waking feel less abrupt. If you imagine preparing to leave now, you may notice there is no reluctance. No fear of losing what you have found here, because the truth revealed by the night is not confined to this place. It lives within the rhythm it helped you remember, a rhythm that will continue to guide you even as the story moves gently toward its close, carrying you with the same patience and care that has shaped every moment so far. As the night reaches its most settled hour, there is a gentle sense that the world is beginning to fold inward, not disappearing, not ending, but gathering itself with care, much like fabric being slowly drawn together at the end of a long day. And the people of this city recognized this phase of the night as something to honor rather than resist, because it signaled not loss, but completion, a natural tapering that allowed rest to arrive without force. In the courtyard, this folding is felt in small ways. The air grows slightly cooler yet remains kind. Lantern flames steady themselves as if conserving energy. Sounds become fewer, more spaced, until each one stands alone without needing to compete. And this reduction was understood not as emptiness, but as refinement, the night selecting only what was essential to remain. If you imagine yourself here now, you might sense that your awareness is no longer reaching outward, no longer scanning the space for details. Instead, it rests closer to the body, closer to breath. And this inward turn is deeply familiar to the human nervous system, signaling that the outer world is safe enough to fade temporarily from attention. The people who lived here trusted this process so completely that they did not mark it with ceremony or words. They simply allowed themselves to be carried by it, confident that nothing important would be lost in the quiet. And in fact, they believed that this folding of the world was necessary for preserving what mattered most, because without rest, even meaning becomes brittle. Historical fragments suggest that this understanding influenced not only nightly routines, but larger cycles as well. Festivals were followed by long periods of stillness, growth by deliberate pause, ensuring that the culture did not exhaust itself in constant motion. And this rhythm, though subtle, allowed resilience to build quietly over generations. In the courtyard, as the night deepens, people begin to rise one by one, not abruptly, but as if responding to an inner signal rather than an external cue. Movements slow and economical, no gestures wasted, and there is no sense of departure as loss, because the space does not close behind them, it simply remains, holding its shape in silence for the next evening, for the next person who needs it. If you imagine standing now, you might feel a gentle heaviness in your body, not fatigue, but readiness, the kind that comes when the mind has been sufficiently soothed, and the body knows it can release further. And this readiness is not something to act upon immediately. It is simply there, waiting patiently. The courtyard itself seems to respond to this readiness by growing even quieter, as though it understands that words and images are no longer necessary, that the work of the night has been largely completed, and what remains is a smooth transition rather than an event. The people of this city often spoke of sleep not as an escape, but as a continuation, a different mode of presence that allowed the self to reorganize without conscious direction. And this perspective removed much of the anxiety surrounding rest, making bedtime something to welcome rather than manage. If you find that your thoughts are becoming more diffuse now, less distinct, That is part of this same folding, the mind naturally reducing complexity as it prepares to move inward. And there is no need to follow or resist this movement. It unfolds on its own when conditions are right. The lantern light in the courtyard remains until very late, not to keep people awake, but to ensure that the transition into darkness is gradual, respectful, and this consideration reflects a broader ethic present in this culture that transitions matter, that how something ends shapes what follows. As the night reaches its quietest point, even the stars seem to hold their positions. More gently, their slow movement barely perceptible, reinforcing the sense that time itself has softened into a supportive background rather than a driving force. The courtyard now feels less like a place and more like a state, something that exists as much inside those who have spent time here as it does within the city. Walls, and this internalization is perhaps its greatest legacy, teaching people how to carry calm with them, even when the space itself is left behind. If you imagine beginning to move away now, you may notice that there is no sharp boundary between staying and leaving. The calm does not drop away, it simply accompanies you, settling deeper into the body as external stimulation decreases. This gentle folding of the world is not something that happens only in this city or in this time. It is a universal rhythm, one that humans have always known, even if they sometimes forget. And tonight, through this story, you are being invited to remember it without effort. As the courtyard recedes softly from attention, not disappearing but resting quietly in the background, the path ahead becomes less defined, less important, because the journey outward is no longer the focus. What matters now is the inward settling, the final easing of awareness into rest, guided by the same patience and care that has carried you through every moment of this gentle night. As the world completes its gentle folding, attention turns almost naturally toward something closer, something more intimate. A return not to a place but to a state. And the people of this city understood this return as the final movement of the night. The moment when external spaces handed their calm back to the individual, trusting that it would be carried inward with care. There was no instruction for this transition, no signal that announced it, only a subtle inward pull, like the tide shifting beneath the surface, and those who listened closely allowed themselves to follow it, without question. If you imagine yourself now at this threshold, you might notice how the story itself feels less like something you are hearing and more like something you are resting inside. Words arriving more slowly, impressions blending together, and this is exactly how the night was meant to feel here, not something to observe, but something to inhabit. The people who lived in this city believed that the self was not fixed, but fluid, shaped moment by rhythm, environment, and attention. And evenings like this were understood as opportunities to gently reshape the inner landscape, smoothing what had become sharp during the day, reconnecting with a quieter sense of continuity. In this state, identity softened, roles and labels loosened their hold, and people felt less like individuals moving through time and more like participants in a larger, ongoing flow, a perspective that brought comfort rather than diminishment, because it reduced the weight of personal striving. Historical accounts describe this feeling using metaphors of water and light, of being carried rather than directed. And while the language varies, the essence remains consistent, a sense of being returned to something fundamental and steady. As you rest here, you may notice a similar shift. Concerns that once felt central now seem distant, not resolved, but temporarily irrelevant. And this is not avoidance, it is restoration. The mind stepping back from constant engagement to allow deeper processes to unfold. The courtyard, though now largely absent from direct awareness, continues to play its role, its quiet consistency having set the conditions for this inward return, and this illustrates a profound truth the people of this city lived by, that external order supports internal ease, and when the environment is kind, the self can be gentle with itself as well. If you imagine the walk home now, it is unremarkable, familiar, steps taken without thought. Lantern light guiding just enough, and this ordinariness is important, because it reinforces the idea that calm does not belong only to special places. It can accompany everyday movement, settling into the spaces between thoughts and actions. Homes at this hour are quiet, doors closing softly, interiors dimly lit, beds prepared not as retreats from the world, but as continuations of this gentle rhythm, and the people who enter them do so without urgency, bodies already half resting, minds no longer gripping the edges of the day. If you notice your own body responding similarly, perhaps a sense of heaviness or warmth spreading, that is a sign that the nervous system recognizes the pattern, aligning itself with an ancient rhythm of rest that predates modern schedules and expectations. The city itself seems to recede now, not because it vanishes, but because attention no longer needs to track it. The outer world having done its work, handing the night over to the inner world with quiet trust. In this inner space, thoughts may still arise, but they do so without insistence. Drifting through awareness like soft clouds, and there is no need to follow them, they pass on their own when not held. The people of this city did not try to control this process. They understood that rest cannot be commanded, only invited, and by honoring the night's gradual transitions, they created conditions in which sleep arrived naturally, without struggle. If you imagine lying down now, the surface beneath you supportive, familiar, you might feel how the body settles more deeply with each breath, muscles releasing their last quiet efforts. And this settling is the final gift of the night's journey, a return to the simplest form of presence. The quiet return to oneself is not dramatic. It does not announce completion. It simply happens. Awareness narrowing gently until only what is necessary remains: breath, warmth, a sense of being held by something larger than effort. As this return completes itself, the story's images grow softer, less defined because their purpose has been fulfilled. They have guided you to this threshold, and now they step back, allowing the night to take over, fully carrying you toward rest with the same patience and care that has shaped every moment so far. There is a moment, just before sleep takes you fully, when the world feels both very near and very far at the same time. And the people of this quiet civilization understood this moment not as a boundary, but as a gentle overlap where waking awareness and rest coexist briefly, sharing the same soft space. And it was here, in this overlap, that everything they had cultivated through the evening finally settled into its deepest purpose. The courtyard, the lanterns, the slow paths and listening night were never meant to be held in memory as images or lessons. They were meant to dissolve into a feeling that could accompany a person into sleep and beyond, shaping dreams and mornings alike in ways too subtle to measure. As you rest now at this threshold, you may sense that the story itself is loosening, its words becoming less distinct, more like a tone or a warmth than a sequence of ideas. And this is as it should be, because stories meant for sleep do not seek to be remembered clearly. They seek to leave behind a residue of calm, a quiet reassurance that lingers even after the details fade. The people of this city believed that places like the courtyard did not disappear when one left them. They simply waited, existing in a state of gentle readiness, available whenever someone needed to return to that rhythm, and this belief extended beyond physical spaces. They trusted that the calm cultivated during the night could be carried within, accessed again through breath, stillness, or even the faintest memory of lantern light. If you imagine the city now, it is fully at rest, streets empty but not abandoned, homes quiet but not asleep in isolation. Everything held together by a shared understanding that rest is a collective act, one person's calm supporting another's, even without contact or awareness. The lanterns have dimmed slightly, not extinguished their glow steady enough to reassure faint, enough to allow darkness its place, and this balance is the final gift of the night, a reminder that light does not need to dominate to be present, and darkness does not need to be feared to be restful. As you lie here, perhaps noticing the gentle rise and fall of your breath, you may feel how the body no longer distinguishes between listening and being held, the two experiences merging into a single sense of ease, and this merging is what the people here recognized as true rest, not unconsciousness, but a state of trust so deep that vigilance becomes unnecessary. History rarely records such moments because they leave no monuments and demand no recognition. Yet they are the moments that sustain civilizations quietly, night after night, allowing people to wake with a little more patience, a little more kindness, and a little less urgency. The courtyard, though now far from awareness, continues to exist in this same way, not as a destination to be reached, but as a reminder that slowness is not a failure of motion, but a different form of wisdom, one that honors the natural rhythms of the human body and mind. If tonight's story has reminded you of a beautiful memory, feel free to share it below, not because it needs to be explained, but because even the act of noticing such memories can deepen their warmth. When was the last time you looked up at the night sky and felt at peace, without needing to name the reason, just allowing that feeling to be enough? Here, no one rests alone. Every story is a soft lantern in the dark, glowing quietly alongside countless others, each one offering the same simple reassurance that there is a place for slowness, a place for rest, and it is never far away. If this story brought you calm, leave a gentle comment for yourself, a small marker of presence, something to return to later if you wish. And don't forget to subscribe for more peaceful nighttime journeys with tedious history for sleep, where history moves softly and the night is always allowed to arrive at its own pace. Now there is nothing more you need to do. The story has carried you as far as it needs to. And what remains is simply the natural unfolding of rest, breath easing, thoughts thinning, awareness narrowing to the quiet comfort of being here. Now, and as sleep draws closer, you can trust that this place, this rhythm, this gentle continuity will remain waiting patiently, ready to welcome you back whenever the night calls again.